Okay, well, um, before we start, I just want to set this meeting in a little bit of context as to where it came from and why we decided to have this session. And it really stemmed from, I think the turning point was a study visit we had to Manchester last year, where we visited Forever Manchester, the community foundation of Greater Manchester. And there, in chatting to the director there, Nick Massey, he referred to a light bulb moment for their community foundation, that it had been going for a number of years, I think at that time, maybe 10, 15 years or so, and not really, earth shattering, not doing a great deal of change. They weren't very satisfied with maybe what they were doing. And Nick encountered Cormac Russell and the concept of asset-based community development. And for him, this was a turning point for the organization. And it transformed itself into one that was really a transactional agency that raised money and gave out grants, into one that really started to work with its own community and to develop the assets within its community. And we met people from their team of community builders there to understand what they were doing. And this really struck a chord with many of our participants, and in particular with those from Spain. So it was Rosa and her colleagues from the Spanish Association who said we should learn a little bit more about this, and we decided to follow up. So here we are now with this session, and Rosa was keen that not only the Spanish community foundations and organizations should benefit from this, but we could open it more widely. So that's where we are today. And why community foundations? Why are community foundations so important to this asset-based community development? Well, it's because they are ideally placed to mobilize assets. They can acquire and accumulate resources, be that money and people, knowledge, and so on. But importantly, they build connections and develop relationships within communities and are trusted institutions in their community, be that a village, a town, a county, a region, or indeed at some levels, a country. So they are critical catalysts for this to happen, whether they are direct interventionists like Nick is with community builders themselves, or whether they play a role as a facilitator by offering grants. That's more of an enabling type role. But either way, they are critical players in this process. So I know from the participants here, we have people from every stage of development, those that are just starting out, to those that are well established, to those that are from those that are interventionist, to others that are grant makers and facilitate the process. Wherever you are on those spectrums, this is of relevance to you. And now I'm very happy to hand over to Cormac. Thank you.
Many thanks, James. That's a lovely introduction, and great to be with you all from all over Europe and indeed beyond. We have friends, I believe, calling in from parts of Africa and other parts of the world. You're all very, very welcome, and it's a delight to be a guest in your conversation. So we're here to think about how ABCD, which means asset-based community development, can be of service to your organizational mission, and how it can support you in supporting community and citizenship, really, at the local level. What I'd like to do, the structure of this conversation, which will last over 2 hours, is I'm going to make 2 short presentations. And as James said, they will be translated. So please do let us know if we're speaking too fast, or if you have any questions, you can use the chat to indicate your questions. But what I'll do to begin with is I'll take some time just to explain what we mean by ABCD and how I think it may be relevant. Then take some time in the larger group for discussion. And the nice part of today as well is we'll be in breakout rooms. And we're going to organize the breakout rooms so you can stay with people who speak the same language as you, but also potentially may have similar questions to you. More on that later on. But let me start by, I suppose, picking up from where James left off. I wanted to start with a little story. So James mentioned there that one of the reasons we're all together now is because of a study trip that he and others, I think Rosa and others, were on to Manchester and to the Foundation Forever Manchester. Well, this must be, I think, at least 15 years ago now. I also had the pleasure of working in the UK with many foundations, actually. There are, I think, 53 community foundations, at least in the UK, certainly that I'm aware of. And I was working quite closely with the peak body, the overall organizing body, and also with a number of local foundations. And it really struck me that Nick Massey from the Forever Manchester Foundation was really excited by what I was saying. So I was telling him a story which I'd like to share with you now. And it was a story that goes back some 30 years from today, from this year. So it was a story that was situated in 1993. And it's a story about our institute, the ABCD Institute, which is based in Chicago at DePaul University in Chicago. And I'm calling in today, I should say, from Dublin, Ireland. So I'm part of the Institute, but I actually travel extensively. My social enterprise nurture development works in 37 countries around the world. So I get to Chicago only about 2-3 times a year. In any case, I was telling them the story about the Kellogg's Foundation. Now, in 1993, the Kellogg Foundation was, I think, the third largest foundation in the world, actually, in terms of its disbursement of funds. So by actual endowment, it was an incredibly large foundation. But they had a very big problem. The problem that they had was that they felt they were funding all of the same initiatives, and that they tended to be funding in a very programmatic sort of way. What they wanted to do was they wanted to figure out how, as a foundation, they could use the fact that they had so much money, not just to provide standard programs and funding, but to use the money, like James said, as a catalyst for much more citizen response, much more grassroots, and much more civic engagement at the local level. So they started working with the ABCD Institute. And the first thing we did was we reviewed their funding applications. And what we realized was that all of their funding applications asked people to talk about what was missing and what was broken and what was problematic in their neighborhoods or in their community contexts. Not one question asked what was good, what were they proud of, what gave them passion, what gave them energy, and what were their priorities. So it was almost as if the foundation had decided what the problem was beforehand, and then was going in and asking the community to confirm they had that problem, and then giving them funding. And then, of course, measuring them afterwards to see if they were good boys and girls and they did what they said they were going to do. This profoundly paternalistic approach was something that the Kellogg Foundation really wanted to change. And I think the main reason they wanted to change that was because they recognized when you've got that amount of money, you can actually change the public and the political narrative for good, but also for bad. And they were trying to be a force for good. So what they did was they turned the whole conversation they were having with communities on its head. And instead of asking communities to tell them what was wrong, they asked them to tell the foundation what was strong within their community and how they were going to use foundation grants to make it even stronger. So I was telling this story a number of years ago, and Nick Massey stood up and said, that's what we do. And if we don't do it, it's what we should be doing. He was saying this to his colleagues, the other foundations. Nick is quite a character. And I think that was a great call to action. Now, subsequently, Forever Manchester have gone on, and they've not alone changed the way that they give out grants. They've also employed community builders to stimulate more community-led action at the neighborhood level. But that's a little backstory to why we are here today. And I just want to honor Nick for his leadership. And indeed, it has to be said, James and Valentina for convening us, and Rosa and others who are excited about today's conversation. So that's a little story. We should always start our conversations with stories because we're story beings. Every conversation is the beginning, middle, and end of some story. So good to be part of your story today. Now, I'd like to call on my slides just to keep us focused and also to help the person that's doing the translation. So I'll make a short presentation and then we can get into conversation and see. I guess my question always when I'm presenting is, how might this be useful in your context? I'm not here as the sage on the stage telling you what you should or shouldn't do. You're the experts of your context. I don't know whether this approach is useful to you or not. And I'm very happy for you to be the guides in that. So this is about you listening to what I have to say, and maybe some of this could be useful, maybe not. And it's not, I don't know if you've recently been to the cinema after COVID lockdowns, but I was at the cinema with my children at the weekend, and we don't normally eat much sugar, but Dad was with them. So I said, okay, well, you know those wonderful pick and mix sweets? I said, you could pick whatever you like. So they were very excited, but of course they didn't pick everything. They picked the parts that made best sense to them and that they were most attracted to. And so as I present, I want you to feel you can do that too. You know, not everything will resonate. For some, the idea of having community builders and being much more interventionist will make sense. For others, changing their funding application is what will excite them. For others, it will be something different, and that's okay. Please know that. So with that, let's go to our slides. So some of what I'm about to share with you, I draw from our latest book, which is a book that I co-authored with the founder of the ABCD Institute and the methodology, and his name is Professor John McKnight. So John and I wrote this book largely because we wanted to write something that was really clarifying for those who want to do community building at the neighborhood level. And this is an important, I think, insight really of our work, that increasingly we find that the greatest level of participation in terms of civic participation is enjoyed when you make the neighborhood the unit of context rather than a particular problem or an issue. So if you could imagine that the neighborhood is what we're trying to animate rather than addressing poverty or addressing food issues, that's something that's a key insight in ABCD. Now, it doesn't mean that we won't get to those issues, but when you use the neighborhood as an animating scale, some really interesting possibilities open out that are hard to get at any other way. So I just wanted to mention that that's the scale that I'm thinking about. And by way of thinking about this conceptually, putting a framework in our heads, I like to think of the idea of a tapestry. So this is a tapestry where tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, big day in Ireland, celebration, and all over the world, in fact, for Irish communities. So happy St. Patrick's Day with all Irish. If you breathe, you're in tomorrow. You're all honorary Irish. But in any case, I love this tapestry. And this comes from St. Patrick's Cathedral, where we launched our book in Ireland, on the island of Ireland. And I love it because it takes so many different diverse threads and it brings them into a meaningful, I think quite beautiful picture. And in many respects, that's what ABCD is all about. How can we take diverse threads, make the neighborhood the loom, and then really create, with community in the lead, create a tapestry of meaning that welcomes strangers, celebrates diversity, and really creates a sense that it's a neighborhood where everybody can thrive and flourish. And I like that metaphor of the tapestry. I think that's a very useful metaphor. So in many respects, when we think about building community where everybody can contribute, we think about three distinct phases for doing that. The first is discovering what resources, what capabilities, what capacities are in this place or in this community that we're interested in animating or supporting. Now, a municipality will have an interest in serving a community from a very particular perspective, and a foundation from maybe a different perspective. But institutions that are outside of a place, outside of a community, that are trying to be useful, often come into the community not to discover what's there, but to deliver what it is they think they have. And this is a real issue, I think, for a lot of communities, because they're not being asked what they have. They're simply being told what the outside agency has and asked whether they want it or not. So the very first phase in our conversation with communities is, what do you have? What do you value? So we shift the conversation from delivery to discovery. And that's a real shift in posture. It's a shift from being the one that knows top down with the solutions or with the money, to the one that's curious, to the one that's humble, to the one that can't know what a community needs until a community has told them what they have, what resources, what assets they have. That's one of the things I admire about the Kellogg Foundation. In 1993, they recognized they were asking the wrong question, that they could not possibly know what a community needs until they first know what's in that half full part of the glass, what a community has. Once we discover what a community has, it's much, much easier then to say to the community, how would you like to connect those assets? How would you like to connect those resources? So when we discover that there's a range of 13-year-old girls living in the neighborhood who are really, really interested in connecting with artists and connecting with productive adults in their neighborhoods, how might we use our funding to enable those two groups to get in right relationship with each other and create their own summer program, as opposed to just funding summer programs? So the discovery and connect piece assumes that we're not funding summer programs, we're discovering what people care about enough to act upon, and then enabling them to connect so they create their own programs. So this really shifts us from product to process. And that's what Nick Massey was really excited about. Instead of prescribing the solution, we were funding a process. You could call it community development. Now, the difficulty there is we didn't know what the outcome would be. I don't know whether in one neighborhood the passion is a number of young girls who want to connect with local neighbors who are artists to do their own summer program. It could be that they want to set up a windmill to create an alternative energy source because the families can't afford to pay the bills. We just don't know. And this is an interesting thing for us. Much of the work we do with communities, it often feels to us like we're walking into a soccer stadium. I sometimes smile when I think about football because I think it's a good metaphor for community. Because in a soccer tournament, you've got 22 people on the pitch who least need the exercise doing all of the hard work. And you've got 30,000 people in the stadium shouting at them, telling them what to do, but actually not doing any work at all themselves. And community can be a bit like that, where you've got a very small minority of people who are doing all of the work, and they're the people that often foundations know about. But then you've got 30,000 people who may be telling everybody else what they ought to do, but not engage themselves, or maybe they just don't know how to engage. And that was a big question that we've been asked over the years. I remember when we started working with the Wellspring Foundation, a Canadian foundation that works in Rwanda, that was their big question post-genocide. As people have been so frightened about engaging in civic life. How do we get alongside them and support them to heal and to reconnect and to rebuild that social fabric and that confidence and to mobilize? That's the third phase, to begin to do things that they feel a sense of ownership of. So I can summarize all of that by saying much of certainly asset-based community development is about helping communities to make visible the invisible. One of the challenges for a lot of communities is if all of the outside agencies are coming in and saying to them, tell us what's in the half empty part of your glass, tell us what you're missing, but they're not asking the community what they have. Well, then what ends up happening is you distort the story. The story becomes about, we're only interested in your deficiencies. We're not interested in your capacities. Now, from a philanthropic point of view, I think that's a real missed opportunity, because I think what you're ending up with is a scarcity model that says we'll use money to fill the half empty part, rather than we'll use money to precipitate the half full part, and together we'll address the half empty part. That's much more, I think, of a liberational, much more of a community development, and much more of a sustainable approach. It's often said that our job in foundations is not to do charity better, but to do philanthropy in such a way that charity is no longer needed. So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways of doing that is by assuming wholeness, by assuming the competencies, by assuming the assets are in the community. We just don't see them yet. They're invisible. So how do we use money? How do we use our influence? How do we use the foundational privilege to make visible the invisible? Well, one of the first things I think we can do is not to make the invisible even more invisible by only focusing on what's wrong. So that there are two, in what I've said so far, there are two shifts in mindset. The first shift is a shift away from the delivery model to the discovery model. And the second is from what's wrong to what's strong. I should say this isn't just ideology. This is grounded in a lot of very strong social science. Here's a snapshot of some of the evidence that you could be perhaps inspired by. Certainly I am. So if your foundation's interested in employment, you are, I'm sure, going to be struck by this statistic, the labor market trends analysis on this. People are 4 times more likely to find sustainable livelihoods if they are connected into a vibrant community and into a good, strong social network. Maybe you're interested in public safety, you're interested in creating safe environments in the urban context. Again, we know from the work of Robert Sampson, who's a preeminent social scientist around safer neighborhoods, that there are 2 key determinants to safety, and it isn't police, interestingly. It's how many neighbors you know by first name and how often they associate in the built environment. They do things together. And what's perhaps most interesting, and I'll stop in a few moments and we can have a conversation about this, but what's I think most interesting is in the area of health. So we know that 80 to 85% of what determines health has nothing to do with medicine or pharmacology, drugs. It's got to do with our community assets, our associational life, our connection in the environment, our economic circumstances. One of my favorite examples is the town of Frome in the UK, a village actually of Frome in the UK, where they put a lot of effort into connecting people at the local level, particularly people who were quite isolated in the third age, senior citizens, and making sure that they knew at least 6 neighbors and were connected into at least 1, if not 2 networks at the associational level. It's really striking that in the county of Somerset, where this village is, over a 3-year period, we saw a 29% increase in hospital admissions, but in the village of Frome, it went down by 17%. And we have evidence to show that that's directly correlated, it's linked to the work that we did around community work. It's really important to, we're not going to be able to engage with communities until we first enable those communities to build. If we don't do that, we'll end up funding the panel, you know, the football team in the middle of the stadium, that are organized enough to set up a funding panel, to make the application, to get the funding from the foundation, to do the work. It's not that they're not good people, of course they are. But their dilemma is, how are they going to get the other 30,000 people not just engaged in what they want them to do, but animated around building community life? And I think foundations could play a very significant social role in that regard. This is the last slide for this presentation, then we'll stop and have a nice conversation together in the breakout. One of the things I want to share with you across the thousands of neighborhoods and villages and small bounded places that we've had the privilege of serving, and indeed, it has to be said, the various institutions we've worked in, I think this is almost universal. I haven't found an exception to this rule. In every single small place we've ever been in, we have found these 6 building blocks of community are always there. Now, they may be invisible, but they are there. And I just want to list them. I've used, and because of course, in honor of it being St. Patrick's Day tomorrow, I've used an Irish symbol. So this is an overlapping Celtic lace. But what you see in this overlapping, interlacing story is the place itself is an asset, the actual physical environment, the built-in natural environment. You see the associations, the clubs, the groups, the social networks. You see the residents, all of whom have ideas, stories, gifts, passions, experiences, sometimes even trauma. You know, that can be a gift too. We also have the economy. I call that the exchange, because it's not just money. It could be exchange of sugar. It could be exchange of smiles. It could be exchange of time. And we have our local institutions, our local stores, our local mom and pop stores, our post offices, if we're lucky, maybe our libraries, these very small, hyper local institutions. And we also have our culture, our local stories that are the stories of we, the stories that bind us together, the stories about this place. And a lot of what ABCD is really about is discovering those assets, connecting those assets, and mobilizing those assets so that people get better outcomes in their lives. So that's a little bit of an introduction. There's more in the second presentation. We're going to go deeper. But in a few moments, what I'd like to do is just to invite some conversation around how you as a foundation are currently working to make the invisible visible in communities, and perhaps whether some of what we've shared here this morning may be useful to you in that regard. It may also surface dilemmas for you. That's okay too, or doubts. They're welcome as well. But it would be nice to have that conversation. So perhaps you could take a photograph on your smartphone or a screen grab of this question. It will help you when you're in the breakout. But before we go to the breakout, I'd like us just to check in with each other. We're a large group, but not too large. I think we're nearly about 40 people. So it's not too big. And I think it's always nice to start our conversations as a whole group before we break up. So let me take this off screen and just ask if anybody has an immediate question or an observation that they'd like to make before we go into the breakout session. And it can be a question of clarification. I'm very happy to address whatever questions you may have. Please do feel free to ask in your own language. We have the benefit of a translator here today as well, so don't let that be a barrier.
There's Zoom user. Go ahead with your question. Zoom user raised its hand.
Hello, thank you very much.
Hi there, welcome.
The point to make visible the invisible. If it's invisible, how can we get it? So invisibility of what? Of existing relationships among the individual. I don't get the
okay.
point of what should be behind to be uncovered.
Okay, so right now, wherever you are, it's a great question, and thank you for asking it, because what you're doing now is that you're making clarity hopefully more visible. It's not visible to you. There's a lot of noise in the background, though. It would be easier for me to, thank you. So let me explain. I live in a neighborhood where I know a lot of my neighbors, but maybe there are people in the, this conversation who don't know a lot of their neighbors. We know that by doing asset-based community development work, and I can talk a little bit more in the second presentation about how we do this, that if we knew about the gifts, the knowledge, the interests, the passions of each of our neighbors, we might, for example, be able to discover on the street or the block where you live that there is in fact an orchestra. But at the moment, they are all individual people. Maybe there's a neighbor that you know or don't know who likes playing the flute. Maybe further up the street, there's a neighbor who likes playing the cello. But actually, currently, they're not an orchestra because they don't even know each other. So in all kinds of ways, we have individuals in our communities that are disconnected, who have all kinds of invisible gifts, assets, contributions to make to their community, but currently they're private to them, to their family. So in a sense, it's invisible to the commons, it's invisible to the public square, it's not in the plaza. And community building work is about saying, my goodness, James, you have a wonderful public speaking voice. We could really benefit from that at the moment. We're trying to do something at the local neighborhood level. Let me tell you about it. And then invite James to bring his gift into conversation. So we know that that's a much more powerful way to invite people into being active, being on the field of play and not being spectators. So that's one example. We also know that in most communities, there are associations, there are clubs and groups. For example, my wife has been a member of a book reading club for 17 years. And I just discovered recently, she's never actually read any books. They don't do that. But when our friends from Ukraine were fleeing, it was that book club in our neighborhood that were actually actively organizing how to support families and settle people in and make sure that they were welcomed and connect them. Now, for that family coming to our neighborhood, my wife's book reading club is invisible. And in fact, even if they had a directory of associations that says book reading club, they would be very confused if they went along with their book to the very first meeting of that book reading club, because actually it's a gin and tonic club. Don't tell my wife I said that. But it's about mutuality, it's about friendship, you understand? So in all kinds of ways, we're using a turn of phrase that maybe isn't translating very well. But when I'm saying make the invisible visible, there's lots of stuff out there right under our nose we don't know about. I'm going to guess you don't know the gifts of every one of your neighbors where you live. I'm going to guess you don't know every club or group. I'm going to guess you don't know all of the small little things that the local shop owner does, which actually helps the neighborhood. But imagine if we were, to reveal all of those things and have a conversation about how they might actually be better connected. That's what I think the Kellogg's Foundation did. They used their grant to make visible all of the assets that were in the neighborhood, that the people who lived there didn't actually realize they had. And everybody went, wow, there's a lot more going on here than we appreciated. And that changed the nature of the conversation from please Foundation, fund us, we're needy, to hey, actually, we're really powerful, but we could use this money to be even more powerful. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good. So that was a really helpful clarifying question. So thank you. Anybody else have a clarifying question before we get Jorge to put us into our first breakout conversation? Okay, I'd suggest then, in the interest of time, that we go ahead and we have our first breakout session. So we have a generous amount of time for that, but mindful of managing our time, we'll take 15 minutes for that. That's an opportunity in groups of 4 for you to get to know each other. Now, what we're going to do here, and Valentina, I'm going to ask you to help me a little bit with this because translation could be useful here, is I think we have 10 rooms, don't we, Valentina? And what we're thinking is we'll do the first 5 rooms where we invite people in groups of 4 who speak Spanish to fill those rooms. Does that seem right still to you, Valentina, in terms of the numbers?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, so, and Jorge is helping us with that. Now, if, as I understand it, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you will see icons, and one of the icons is breakout room. So they should be set up so that you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right through to 10. What we're asking is our friends who are speaking Spanish to fill those rooms. Can you see those, Jorge? Have you set those up for us?
Yes, right now they're active, but
Okay, because I see Rosa shaking her head. She's saying she doesn't see them.
well, if you're not able to see them, there's three dots on the right bottom part of your screen, and if you click them, you see more options that don't fit on your bar. And besides subtitles, you have break rooms and support.
Okay, so if everybody can go into the breakout option that way and start filling those who are speaking English or speaking another language, if you just hold back for a few minutes, let's try and fill those rooms. So there's 4 per room and we'll self-organize. It'll be a bit messy, but we'll figure it out.
Tienes que crearlas, ¿no, Jorge? Porque yo veo solo...
Están ya creadas, hay 10 salas. Las tengo que abrir.
Ahora.
Y ahora
Ahora
pueden
sí.
ustedes acceder a ellas.
Yeah.
Entonces los
So, Jorge,
españoles escojan de la 1 a la 5.
okay. So I see there's people going in now. Good. Okay, and for those that are speaking English or another language, the rooms that are signed for you are 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Try to keep the rooms to no more than 4. So when you see 4 people in there, go to another one of the rooms that are open. And if you could do that now, that would be great. And if anybody needs help, please just stay back and we'll be happy to support you. Jorge can assign you directly, so just unmute and let us know if you need help.
I'm wondering because I'm seeing that in room 1 there are 6 people and in room 5 there are only 1 people. Maybe should I go to room 6 and tell people to move from room 1 to room 6? Sorry, to room 5?
I think if it's just one person, do it the other way around. Put the one person in another room. It'd be easier.
Okay.
Yeah. And sorry, I'm calling from my phone here, and I don't seem to have the breakout rooms option. So if you could just put me in an English-speaking room, please, James. Thank you.
So that would be probably room 9, Jorge, for James. There's only 2 people in that.
So would you like me to rearrange room 1 so there's only 4 people there?
Yeah, certainly send them the option to go into. Well,
should I just leave
at least take maybe put at least one maybe Zoom user, give him the option to go into room 3. I think leave the rest. Right. He can accept it or not. It won't be problematic. Yeah, it's fine. I think it may well be that people have gone into rooms where they know people. But I see that there's 6 unassigned. That's what's concerning me more.
Yeah, but most of them are just PCs on my end, except for
Oh, I see.
Irene
Okay.
and Richard, which haven't joined any
Okay.
rooms. Should I go
I
ahead
see.
or just wait for them?
Well, they can accept or reject an assigned option. So maybe just go ahead and offer those 2
Like room 9 and 10, for
a
example.
room. Yeah, yeah. I think that's good. Yeah. And then we just need to watch time. So what time we're
It's quarter
giving
to
them 15
10.
minutes?
It's gonna be.
Yeah, yeah. By the time everybody is settled in. Okay, so
Okay,
all
one more
right.
user came in
So let's
to
bring them back.
at 10.
Okay. All right. Let's bring everybody back then for top of the hour.
All right. There's one
Okay.
last user that just came into the session, Katya.
Katya. Hi, Katya. How are you? Welcome. Can you hear me? Katya, can you hear me? Okay, Katya, if you can hear me, we're going to assign you to a breakout room where people can tell you what's been discussed.
So,
Katya, do you want to be in an English or a Spanish breakout room?
maybe she's still setting up her computer.
No, she's communicating through chat. Katya, English.
English,
Thank you.
please.
Okay, wonderful. We'll do that right now, Katya. Thank you. Okay, we'll do that right now. Enjoy the conversation.
Room 7, for instance.
Danielle, do you want to go into one of the rooms or do you want to stay out?
Yeah, I think I will do that. I was just curious about what were you doing when you were outside the breaking rooms. So just right now that everything is settled down, I will join.
Just troubleshooting. So do you want me to move you to Spanish or English?
I think I will join the room 2. It's yeah, for people. So I go
room
there.
2. Room 2. Okay. Good.
Sí. Correcto.
Okay. Do you want to pause the recording for the breakout sessions? Everybody else will be back in about 10 seconds. Okay, could we take down the holding slide here so I can see everybody when they return? Wonderful. That's great. And could you take the spotlight off me so that we could all be equal in this conversation? So just make a gallery view, or maybe I can do that myself. Yeah, perfect. Good. That feels much more equitable. Good. Welcome back, everyone. Good to see you all back. I hope you had a nice conversation. And we're going to take a few moments to just debrief, be curious about what surfaced in each of our colleagues' little circles and see if we can learn from each other. So we'll take about 10 minutes to debrief. And what I'm curious about really is what struck you from that small group conversation. We were having a conversation around the question, how do you make the invisible visible? And we clarified what we mean by that. In other words, how do you reveal the assets in the local communities that you're trying to fund? How do you support them to see that they also have contributions And it's not just about money. It's not just about funding. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and your insights from your small group conversation. And it's open. You can use the chat, of course, please do. But also, I always feel less lonely when I hear voices. So please also vocalize. And Rosa, you very generously put your hand up. Jorge has asked me to ask you if you would use either your on-land hand or your digital hand, like Rosa is doing, if you'd like to speak. So that would be helpful. Rosa, it's very generous for you to start us off. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts. You'll have to unmute.
Yep. It was not available before, so here it is. Right. Well, thank you, Cormac. I'm gonna try to summarize the what we talk in our small breakout room, and then if my colleagues want to say something else, of course they are more than welcome. Well, one of the things is that the first part of your session resonates and sparks new ways of looking at things. One of the things that came up is like, right, are there methodologies to do this? Are there methodologies to get our fellow citizens to understand that playing the violin or training, as a runner every day can be an asset for the community? How do we put that? Because they might not be aware of that. Another thing that was said in our group is the importance that the foundation is seen as a trustworthy organization. And once, and this was about a community foundation that started very recently, they started with small things that are not so difficult to do. They are, gathering people in sessions to talk about the history of the valley, and they have full house. And it's interesting because this, which is very easy to do, was not done by anyone before. By these small successes, people are approaching now the community foundation and saying, we could do this, we can offer that. This community foundation is also being very mindful about creating groups that are very diverse, especially on the age range, and that is bringing a lot of assets and ideas to the community foundation. Other things that has been said about how to get people to come forward with those assets that they have is maybe giving inspiration. Another community foundation works in areas which are with a very low population, and in many places people are not yet being active about doing things because they don't know where to start. So what the community foundation is doing is bringing ideas of things that are happening in other regions nearby them that have the same characteristics, and this is giving them inspiration to actually come forward and say, okay, now I can offer this, or I can offer that. So I would say that the other thing important is that the thing about the needs or the assets, in our room there were discrepancies about what comes first, and yeah, there were discrepancies about people that are hands-on. So that was very, very interesting. But also it was surfaced that when you start talking with people about needs, you're putting them in a different situation. I mean, you just start exercising different levels. The other thing that was brought in the conversation is how important it is to work with informal groups, how to, get outside, the established foundations, associations, or institutions, and how the community foundation have to give a space to those groups so they can actually, come forward and express, what they have and what can they offer to the community. I have tried to summarize what I say in my room. My fellow colleagues can jump if I miss anything.
Rosa, that was very impressive, and thank you for starting the conversation off. That's a generous act. Anybody from Rosa's group want to add or emphasize anything that Rosa has shared there, which is very inspiring? You got a lot in 15 minutes. Wonderful. So methods, I love that insight around trusted convener. Recognizing that you are a trusted convener and that convening is an act of leadership in itself. But then being thoughtful about how you convene so it respects and actively invites diversity, even when that might be difficult for the group that you're working with. Then there's the dilemma of how do you get people to come forward? How do you inspire? And then how do you balance bringing outside ideas in to inspire people who maybe are not coming forward, but at the same time not telling people what to do or prescribing the solution? And then I love that insight around there's a big difference between starting the conversation with your needy and needs and the conversation that starts with assets and the message is you're needed, but you also sometimes have needs. How do you balance that out? And then huge point at the end there, Rosa, around informal groups that may not have a constituted framework or governance structure are hugely important to be in the conversation. How do we engage them? Especially if we're working across a country or we're very distant from local contexts, right? So there's a lot in there. So rather than other groups repeating what Rosa's group has shared, let's just say thank you to them for saying what we wanted to say. And let's add to that because we need to be mindful of our time here as well. So let's go to Rosemary next, calling in, I think, from the UK, Rosemary.
Yes, morning, Cormac.
Hi, good to see you.
You and I have worked together in the past.
Yes, we have.
When I was at Wiltshire.
Yeah.
Just a couple of reflections from our group. We were very lucky to have two people who are actually doing this kind of work in the Netherlands and also in England at the moment. One in a rural context and one, I think, in a sort of small town context. First of all, it was really important that you went out to find the people, and the people weren't necessarily going to come to you. And the other question the other topic that came up was how reluctant some of the foundations are, the management of the foundations are to adopt a new approach, and how do we convince our board of trustees and philanthropists who maybe are quite risk averse in trying this new approach towards asset-based development. We had a super conversation and we were cut short in the middle of a fantastic story. So Jan, I'd love to pick up that story with you afterwards and hear about it. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Rosemary. It's great to see you again. And Rosemary also a great pioneer of this way of working as well. So great to have your insights. Dean, I saw you nodding profusely as Rosemary was sharing there. Did you want to come in on anything or add anything to what she shared from your own experience? You're not being allowed to unmute for some reason.
Oh, there
here we go. There we go.
No, I was agreeing because I was in Rosemary's group, and so she was saying a lot of the things.
Yes. Okay.
We'd discussed.
Good. Doing a good job.
But I think community conversations and convening is a key part of that, making that visible. Invisible visible.
That piece around conveying the value of going out and being in conversation to, in a governance sense, to your donors, your philanthropists, etc. Has anybody got anything to share about that? I mean, in a sense of a success story around that, where you've been working with a governance structure that was quite resistant to that way of working, but you managed to bring them along, you managed to convey the value of this way of working to them. And because I think it might be helpful to frame the problem up for sure, but it's also quite nice for people to hear that there's a solution to that problem. So does anybody have a story to share about how they solved that? So Rosemary, I'll bring you back in again to answer your own question in a sense.
Yeah, just to say that I think sometimes it's very difficult to be a prophet in your own land, and you actually need to bring in somebody outside to tell the people that there is a different way of doing things. I think that's really important. Ask somebody else who's been doing it and it's working where they are to come in and talk to your boards.
That's a great tip. Thank you, Rosemary. Alejandro.
Thank you. Yeah, we were able to convince our board at Fundación Maimona in Spain about the need of changing the scope from a strategic plan, classic one, 3 years, programs, actions, to assume that we were not able to draft a clear strategic plan in a very chaotic environment, and we decided to propose enacting a social lab as the ways of proceeding. And it was working for a couple of years, and it was very successful. So I have to say that this living lab methodology, living lab adapted to social scope, is very useful, or at least it was in our case.
That's great, Alejandro. Thank you. And if you have any links, and we should do that, I think as we progress in this conversation, if you've got reference points, I'm sure people would welcome those. Many may know about the Living Lab. It's a wonderful model, but others may not. Wonderful. Danielle. Danielle is a colleague of mine here at Nurture Development, so welcome.
Hello. I was just talking with the group that we have some resistance with the NGO I'm working with here in Alicante, that is Architecture Without Borders, because we are using the ABCD methodologies. So we are discovering resources within the deprived neighborhoods in Alicante in order to connect them with the problems that are also being asked to us to answer. So at the end, volunteers and beneficiaries are the same people. And when we put that in the papers in order to justify, yes, the NGO is saying that we are doubling the people we are working with, but actually they have both roles. So this is right now a resistance that we are having, but I think a very interesting one.
Yes, yes. And one of the things that's really interesting in our work, Nurture Development, is the insight that when working with people in this methodology, sometimes a dedicated space needs to be created for donors so they can really begin to reimagine their role and reimagine it through the lens of ABCD. As you say, Daniel, there's all kinds of perceptions or assumptions that are built into that role because it's so removed from this way of thinking. And I think we have to be compassionate and just go on the journey with them. So there's an element at which we sometimes say that communities are auditioning donors and they're trying to find the ones that can best match their assets. This is a very different way of thinking about how you make change happen. So here we're talking about making the change happen from the ground, the grassroots up, rather than the top down. And something in your story suggests to me that what you're doing is you're teaching the donor how to treat you and how to treat community and changing the power relationship, which is never easy. It's a good sharing. Thank you. Anybody else like to add to the wonderful list that we've been creating together of both challenges or dilemmas and, it seems, some really good ways forward as well? Camille. Let me see if I ask you to unmute, does that help?
Yep, that helps. Thank you. So we were speaking a little bit about the role which municipalities can play as well. So like if they work together with the social workers or community builders, what does it mean? And Helen was in Rotterdam and she saw it, how it worked. She described it, but as well, Caroline is actually working in Rotterdam. So we had directly like someone who were doing the study visit. And when we were speaking about, how important is mapping, and it might be our task or the task of the community, we come to that point, okay, we mapped the resources, people, and then we are asking ourselves, should we actively connect those people? Which role should we be playing? Because if we will connect them, like it's our decision who will connect with who, and what's the right role, how we should go. We didn't find any answer to that. There was like there was a time cut.
Good question. Yeah. Can I press pause on that, because I think this is important, and there's a risk here we may lose people, because some people are coming to this conversation and they may not know much about the methodologies we use, and others are using the methodologies already and have questions. So let me just make sure that we level up the playing field. So what Camille is sharing there is a method that's used in asset-based community development called asset mapping, as distinct from doing a needs analysis. So typically what a lot of foundations do is they ask, what are the needs in a place or in a particular community? And then they try to use money, to address those issues. We flip that on its head and we encourage the use of asset mapping, which is another way of saying, make the invisible visible, go out and find out what's in the neighborhood, in the communities. Now, Camille's asking a really important question. Who should do that? If the reason that we're doing asset mapping is to enable the people who live in the local context to really understand the value of what they have within and around them, then the answer, Camille, is the foundation should not be doing the asset mapping. They should be creating the conditions for the people who live there to do the asset mapping. That might involve employing, like say, for example, some of the foundations in the UK do. It may involve employing a skilled community animator, community builder, who knows how to help the community. Particularly, somebody asked the question earlier on, how do we work with communities that are really disconnected, maybe living in very rural contexts, maybe quite oppressed after a natural disaster, for example. And it's a question about getting the right level of intervention. We don't want to do nothing because nothing will happen. So we're so purist, we say we will only do this the pure ABCD way. People have to lead. Well, that's fine, but if nobody leads, nothing happens. So there is a middle ground, a middle way, where, for example, take what Nick Massey is doing, or take, I think we have people from LSA in the Netherlands on the call, and then I think we have Helen also from VIA Foundation. And so they can share this with you, I think. So what I think they're trying to do is think about how do we season community development practitioners who understand how to get the balance right. So they're not doing to or for community, but they are using good community development to create the conditions within which community can begin to do this and own this themselves. So that might be saying, as a foundation, we will fund local community artists. See, the interesting point here is I loved the insight that Rosa's team was sharing earlier. We have convening power. So if we say we're not going to give you funding for projects until we fully know what you have locally, and we will fund local community artists and maybe even fund a skilled community builder to help you over a period of 3, maybe more months, maybe I would say even a year, to just do the work, to find out and to connect. And then we will sit down with you and we'll go on to the next phase of funding. I guarantee you, it's like Alejandro was saying earlier on, it's like the living lab. What you're doing is you're moving from a mile-wide, inch-deep strategy that's just about projects and initiatives to an inch-wide, mile-deep strategy that's about genuine democratic participation. So Camille, to your point, no, you shouldn't be doing the asset mapping. But, a balance has to be struck. So what's that middle ground? So it's a great question. I think you probably know the answer yourself. I could see you smiling as you were asking it. So good insight. Thank you. Anybody else want to add before I go on to the next part of the presentation, where I will take all of these questions and do my best to be attentive to them? But is there anything that we haven't heard shared that you feel is important to raise at this point? No, that feels comprehensive. Good. So let me perhaps share with you briefly. And again, I'm happy if something wells up inside of you and you want me to stop, just, you know, raise your hand or come in and unmute, and I'll happily engage in conversation. But for the next 15 minutes or so, what I would like to try to do is to pick up these questions, which are mainly about how do we do this on Monday morning, and how do we do this in a way that's sensitive. So it really does take account of diverse challenges, but also diversity. And then some questions about politics with a small p. How do we get our systems aligned to this way of working? And particularly if we've worked in a very different way before. So they're really important questions. And I think this is a taster. This is 2 hours where we begin to open up this conversation, and hopefully it opens up into a broader set of inquiries where you can reach out, connect with each other. There are lots of people on this call who are experimenting with this way of working already. So you have many fellow travelers who I'm sure would be happy to have a virtual coffee with you and say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we're learning. Here's what's really been tricky, but here's what's really been energizing. And there's no better way to learn, I think, than that way. That's, as you know, peer-to-peer. But in any case, let me start by picking up the question of methods. How do we do this? So I'm not going to, in the next few minutes, teach you all of the methods of ABCD, but I can begin to list some of them. So you've already heard Camille very kindly share one, and that's asset mapping. I'm always a bit cautious about that term because, well, you all know this phrase. I think the map is not the territory, which means that, you know, when you actually go into a living community, a living neighborhood, the first thing that gets tested are your assumptions. You begin to discover all kinds of nuances and complexities that just don't appear on a map, you know. But I think the idea of asset mapping really is to go with genuine curiosity. And I think Rosemary shared that insight. We have to be willing to go there. You know, some people were talking about municipalities doing this work. I remember many years ago working with True Sport Canada, which is a foundation dedicated to sport in Canada. And they've got two very interesting ambitions. One is to reduce the amount of illicit substances, illicit drugs, performance-enhancing drugs in sport in Canada. But the other is through sport, which is the inclusion of all peoples and all diversity in sport in Canada. So I spent 3 days with them in 2009 in Ottawa, and we met with 33 of the major CEO, you know, the Basketball Association, Rugby Canada, et cetera, and we sat in conversation, and all of us agreed at the end of 3 days that sport is an incredible asset for community building, but it's become very much about elitism and about the individual. So they were really curious about how True Sport Canada as a foundation could really bring sport and the spirit of sport back into community life. An incredible conversation. They reached out to the Community Foundation of Canada, which is a wonderful institution that looks after foundations in Canada. And from there, we worked with 4 foundations and 4 municipalities to begin to try to reshape the national conversation about sport in Canada, and remind kids particularly that sport isn't about just excelling as an individual, but really is about community. And, you know, it's just interesting to think about what methods they used. So they used a number, and let me list them. They used community conversations, believe it or not. So they said, let's go local. So the municipalities and the foundation said, let's reach out to neighborhoods in our particular municipality that would really like to have this conversation. Let's make them, to use Alejandro's point, let's make them living labs. Let's learn with them. So the municipality and the foundation reached out to 2 or 3 neighborhoods and said, could we journey with you for a year and a half? We're going to teach you how to do asset-based community development. So they reached out to the sporting organizations, their members in each of those neighborhoods, and they taught them how to do asset mapping, number 1. which we talked a little bit about. That's literally going out. You'll remember that list of 6 assets that I showed you in the overlacing image at the end. They literally went out with local people and did community walks, had community conversations, went into the places where people bump into each other, gather together, and started to really identify those assets and what people wanted to do with those assets. So that's one methodology. But the other is what we call learning conversations, or sometimes what we like to call a listening campaign. And that's where we're literally going out and we're finding people in the local neighborhoods who are really interested in sharing their story, sharing their priorities, sharing their ambitions for their community, for their neighborhood, and not just as a shopping list of what they need. But it's really interesting when you say to people something like, for example, Barbara, if 3 of your neighbors were willing to help you, what would you love to do with them? It's remarkably striking how many people have an answer to that question. Now, they also have an answer to the question, what's wrong with this neighborhood? And by the way, I can give you the answers to save you a lot of community consultation. It will be the behavior of young people, parking issues, dog poop, and 1 or 2 others. We kind of know already. And at the moment, it pedals in and out. So loneliness is another one. We know from the Vancouver Foundation that in fact, the issue of loneliness in neighborhoods is featuring ahead of safety and economic struggles. So we know the issues, but it's very interesting when you get into the granular and local context to find out what it is people care about enough to act upon, as opposed to what their opinions are. And you find that out by having listening conversations. So if we go back to Nick Massey's story, what he's done is he's employed community builders to be roving listeners, to actually go into neighborhoods and to listen to people. And of course, what's really interesting is he's listening they, I should say, are listening not just for problems, but also for possibilities. Where's the energy? What do people care about? Because if you start with what people care about enough to act upon, you answer the question you asked earlier, how do we get people involved? Well, it's very hard to get people involved with a predefined agenda. We build it and they will come. Is not a great strategy. It works sometimes if you get it right, but it's a high risk strategy. But we listen to them, find out what they care about enough to act upon, cheer them on and resource them. That's a way better strategy. If your question is, how do we support people to be the leaders of change? And we see that in Rotterdam. If you think about the Upsumeren movement in Rotterdam, 1,600 street-led groups. If you think about Delfshaven in Rotterdam, where the foundation are actually, and forgive my accent, I apologize but I'm really inspired by what they're doing, because here you see foundations working really closely with municipalities, working really closely with police, but all of them are taking so much care to make sure that local residents feel like they're in the driving seat. And this is the problem and challenge all in one. If I'm a police officer and I define security as the issue, then police become the key actors. If I'm a local resident and I define well-being and connection as the key issue, then community become the key actors. But by connecting the community more effectively, you get the safety outcome as well. So I think what's exciting about foundations is, you'd mentioned municipalities, of course, I want to honor them too. But I think I'd like to go back to something James said at the beginning, because I thought it was incredibly insightful. I think community foundations are in a much better position than a lot of our friends in local and federal state government, because they're so restricted in so many ways in terms of what they must do and how their funding must be used. But community foundations is one of the very the very remote opportunities that a community has to actually have a non-governmental, non-political conversation about their priorities. So for me, community foundations have really got an incredible offer. And to this, I want to share a quick story, and then I'll go back to my slides before we go to the next breakout. This is a story from the Nebraska Community Foundation. And incidentally, when I share the story, I do want to acknowledge the work of LSA in the Netherlands as well, because I think there's a lot of overlap there in terms of making the neighborhood the focus. But Nebraska Community Foundation is a really interesting case study, I think. And I would commend that you look at their website and spend some time after this conversation being curious about them. So Nebraska Community Foundation, about 20 years ago, decided they wanted to use asset-based community development as their lens, the lens through which they would think about themselves as an organization and think about the work that they do. And the Nebraska Community Foundation is led by a very inspirational individual who's also very humble. His name is Jeff Yost. Jeff Yost. Now, Jeff, by background, is an economist, a very gifted economist. So 20 years ago, Jeff was looking across. Nebraska is a very big state, as you know, in the United States, but it's quite sparsely populated and quite diverse in terms of urban, rural, and suburban. And he did what most economists would do, I think, at the beginning of their tenure 20 years ago. He did an analysis of the future, economic future of the towns and villages and small local places in Nebraska. And he identified two things as a result of that analysis. The first was, if these towns and villages and small urban and suburban and rural places kept doing what they were doing, they would capitalize the death of the state. In other words, they would finance all of their young people leaving the state to go to college out of state, to buy their first home out of state, to marry out of state, to set up their business out of state. So their biggest export in Nebraska 20 years ago was their young people. Now, the first time that people had that mirror held up to them was when the Nebraska Community Foundation held it up, because nobody else was really thinking in these terms. Nobody was really thinking about the future of our small local places. They were thinking about big ticket issues like the economy, maybe the welfare of young people, but they were dealing with issues in silos, because that's what our institutions tend to do. So the Community Foundation, the Nebraska Community Foundation, were the first people to check the vital signs of places, of the actual communities themselves. And Jeff is a very pragmatic person. So when I spoke with him about this, he said, well, it seemed obvious to me, if we've got the word community in our title, we should care about communities in our work. And he jokingly said, I am struck by the number of community foundations that aren't actually doing anything about community. They're maybe funding the third, this is a Nick Massey joke, by the way, the third celloist on the left of the orchestra that's set up by a community, but they're not looking after the village. They're not looking after the neighborhood. Out of that process, Jeff's work and his team, they began a new conversation with people in Nebraska. The first thing they did was they read the obituary notice, right? This is what they read about you after you're dead. You know, Cormac was a lovely guy. I hope that's what they say. He gave a lot to his community, but they gave them a living obituary. They said, by 2050, if you keep doing what you're doing, your small towns and your urban neighborhoods will be dead. What do you want to do about that? And how can we be useful to you? So they started a new conversation. And there's nothing focuses the mind of somebody like something like that. Now, a lot of these places didn't know what to do. And so the Community Foundation of the Nebraska said, well, how about we start helping you and supporting you, for example, to create local endowments for your town. This is a really interesting thought, I think. You know, he was saying things to local leaders in neighborhoods and towns such as, for example, what if you have 3 children in your family and you imagined that in fact you have a 4th child, and the 4th child is your town? So if you could take a 4th of whatever you invest and put it into your local economy, into your town through this endowment, you could potentially create opportunities for your other 3 children to stay here, to start building a future here, to start building a new economy here. And you know, that's exactly what we're seeing in Nebraska happening now. They recognize that in order to do that, as well as building town-based endowments, so the Nebraska Community Foundation provide the financial infrastructure and the governance structure, the fiscal management, to enable these towns to have their own endowments, to reinvest locally. But what they also do, which I think is really, really powerful, is like Nick Massey and others are doing in the UK, and we're seeing LSA support, they're beginning to employ community builders who are going into the neighborhoods and the towns and starting those conversations that I think Rosa and others were talking about. So what they've realized is that, and I think, Helen, you're probably realizing this as well in your work, so you might want to share on this. I think they're realizing that foundations are a powerful convener, and that many conversations will only happen if they move in and they say, what do you want to do about this place, about this economy, about this ecology? Helena, maybe I'll pause there and to say, is there anything you'd like to share? I know you're very early in your conversation, but I'm very excited about the work you're doing.
Thank you, Cormac. Yeah, I would have to say yes. We are trying to get there, or we are in that conversation, looking at the role that local foundations can play in activating their own communities or being a support system for that kind of activity, as well as other local initiatives. Interestingly, now with the war in Ukraine, we're looking at community centers as well as a place that can support that kind of citizen activity in support of integration of Ukrainians in Czech communities. So there's a lot of different avenues to get to that place that we're exploring. Yeah, certainly.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. And you know, it's interesting, just again, thinking about this across all of the diverse context that you're working in and you will work in this kind of poly crisis that is our future. It's fascinating to think about how a community foundation can be a precipitator, can be an animator. And the Nebraska Community Foundation, in classic American upbeat style, called what they do, turn up your dream switch. So their message to local places is turn up your dream switch. What do you dream of? What do you imagine? What do you want for this place? And how can we support you economically, but also in terms of capacity building? How do we support you to fulfill that? So I love that because it brings the conversation beyond projects into culture, meaningful, enduring culture change. I have 1 or 2 slides I'd like to share, and then, you know, let's if we have time, go into a quick breakout and then some final reflections as to where we might want to go from here. So let me just call up my slides very briefly. So one of the ways I feel that we can think about communities is to think about them as having functions, not as dysfunctional, but as having functions or roles. Often we think about our institutions, like our hospitals, for example, have the function of healing or providing some health-related intervention. But I don't know that we always think about our communities as places that have functions. So in our latest book and in our work, we have identified 7 key functions that we believe communities play. And they're functions that often neighborhoods, communities don't know that they have. So again, in the spirit of, you know, showing the overlacing nature of them, I represent them here. But let me just briefly and rather quickly go through those functions with you. And I think you'll recognize that communities are key to this. So looking after and being a steward in our local economy, we know that the Isle of Egg, for example, in the Hebrides off the Scottish coast, they went off grid in 2008. So they've created an alternative energy source using wind energy. They couldn't have done that without the stewardship and the support of intelligent and wise funders and philanthropic investment. But since 2008, ahead of the curve, they've created those energy alternatives, which is enabling them to steward their ecology in a much more elegant way, and also to support young people to stay on island. We're seeing in places like in the west of Ireland and Westport, which is a population of about 6,000 people, a lot of families struggling to pay the bills at the moment. A lot of families really struggling to make ends meet at the moment, to just survive financially. But one of the initiatives that they're looking at in Westport is what they're calling an EV fleet. So this is a fleet of vehicles that would be available in the neighborhood, taking the burden off individual families for having to own their own forms of transport and making the neighborhood the economic unit. So this is a response to transport issues, to ecological issues, to health issues, and to economic issues. Incredible. This is not a solution that would come any other way than from the ground up, I think. This came from communities, and they're looking for foundations and others to get around those ideas so that they can create. Obviously, a smartphone is particularly important to make this particular idea work as well. But food, again, we're looking, more than ever over the last few years, we're beginning to realize that the issues of food sovereignty are coming home and they're local. Many of you may see it on your local shelves at the moment, particularly if you're in the UK, but in other countries as well. We see it following the war in Ukraine. We see it in relation to issues with the Suez Canal and distribution. In all kinds of ways, people are really beginning to try to understand how we can move much more into a cooperative land trust, food-owned, food sovereign, in-season way of thinking about what we consume and what we produce. It's often said it takes a village to raise a child, but I think that's true. If it's true, and I believe it is, what does it take to raise a village? So often the questions we're asking are instrumentalized. We think about the children, but we're not thinking about the village question. It's true in health as well. We talked about this already, but a lot of what we're trying to do is think about the neighborhood, the village, the small places like an organism. We think a lot because we're programmed to about the World Wide Web, but we might also think about the Wood Wide Web, thinking at that very hyper-local level of how do we begin to use our influence as foundations to precipitate those very hyper-local responses, but also then, and I think this is really important too, how do we enable those hyper-local responses to be in conversation with each other, to inspire each other? So it's not just about us bringing a template of inspiring ideas, but it's about bringing people who are doing the work into conversation with others that are like them and enabling those conversations to flourish, a bit like, the mycelial network in a wood or a forest. I really feel that community foundations are the great connectors. And I think Rosa's point around trust is well made. All of this work happens at the speed of trust. And who am I going to trust more than a community foundation that doesn't have a political bent or influence, that is actually free to begin to open up these conversations so that I can feel I have some leadership, I have some contribution. So I think that's the potential. I want to stop there because what I think doesn't matter, actually, what you think matters. So what I'm curious about is perhaps we could take, 10 minutes to quickly get back into our small breakout sessions again and just have a conversation and a sharing with each other around what you feel this conversation may open up and what you would like to see happen from here. Maybe what might be some next steps, or how might we build on this conversation and take this energy forward. So Jorge, if you could please open the rooms again. And again, if you just join the same breakout room that you were in previously, that would be wonderful. It's a short breakout, it's 10 minutes, then we'll come back and we'll debrief. I think James may have a few words of closing as well for us. Thank you. Great, good. So the whole idea of this conversation, as James said, is to open up a possibility conversation, give you a taste of what might be possible, give you some understanding of what ABCD may or may not be useful for you to do with. And we've got to the end really of the process of today. So what we'd like to do is just in the chat, because we don't have a huge amount of time left and we want to respect your time, is if you could please just share a bullet point or two around what possibilities you see for this conversation going forward. And if there aren't any, that's okay. We're not fishing for compliments here, but we're just curious to see if you think this is a conversation that has merit and if there's some possibilities in using ABCD going forward. Obviously, we have a range of training and a range of things we do. We don't have time to do all of that in 2 hours. Just taking this taster at face value, what possibilities do you see going forward? And if you could put that into the chat, that would be great in whatever language feels right to you. Thanks, Rosemary. Thank you, Alba. Thanks, Helen. James. Kim. Of course, we haven't had time today to talk about banking and circular economy, but maybe some other time we can talk about that too. Thanks, Andre. Have you? Thank you. And of course, ABCD is not a cure-all. It is not a panacea. So nor should it be. So there are many other things that you do that are hugely important that can sit alongside this way of working as well. It's not a replacement for all of the important and valuable work you do. Just as you finish sharing these, I think, quite inspiring possibility statements, which I thank you for. Can I just say a huge thank you before I hand over to James to close us out? It's always a pleasure to be a guest in a conversation like this, and thank you for all you do as well to build community. So onwards and over to James.
Thank you, Cormac.
Cormac, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining. Just a couple of little things. I want to give Helen Lenda a moment to say a few words about a fantastic opportunity that the VIA Foundation offers in a way that you can bring forward in practice the application of ABCD, the community alphabet, as they call it. So I'll hand over to Helen in just a moment. But as far as this conversation is concerned, we want to continue it. We want to continue it with you and with others in the Community Foundation movement. So critically, we will, and it's not just a standard sort of evaluation of how the meeting went, we'll send you a very brief survey after the meeting ends, but critically we will be asking you within that of how you would like this conversation to continue, how this would be of value to you, so that we can generate some sort of form of community of practice and continue this learning and this sharing of experience that we have. It is making visible the invisible that exists within the Community Foundation field. That's what I want to achieve from this. So Helen, if you are still, I hope, on the call, if you want to say a word or two about the opportunity that VIA Foundation is offering.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. So as James mentioned, as he said, we have a program called Community Alphabet, which is an international peer exchange program around community building practices. And we lean heavily on ABCD. We've worked closely with Cormac, and thank you, Cormac, for all the cooperation that we've had with you. And it's a program for about 20 practitioners from different countries who are interested in exploring asset-based approaches to connect diverse groups of people across their communities. And we have a call right now, open until the end of March. The program is for people from community foundations as well as those from other community groups or initiatives who are doing this kind of work. So it's about a year and a half long capacity building program. So if you are interested, maybe the best way is to contact James and he can put you in touch with me. Would that be okay? Or actually in the chat, I can put a link. I can put a link to more information from our website for those of you who are interested. I would love to talk to you about this opportunity. We can set up a call. So thanks again for the opportunity to make a little pitch. And thank you so much, Cormac, for this session today. It was great.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Helen. Helen, do put the link in there, but you'll also find information on this on the ECFI website, and there should be a link there to it. But the deadline is the end of this month, so conscious of that. So just a final thank you so much, Cormac. That really was inspirational. You know, I felt and I knew from Manchester that there was interest in this, that there was definitely something that we needed to dig a little bit deeper. And I love that the metaphor you used about, you know, not a mile wide, an inch deep, but an inch wide and a mile deep. And that's where we're going with this. With the community foundation field, we really want to drill deep to explore the potential that there is, and you've certainly whetted our appetites. I know normally it's the several days worth of a course to enable people to really get to grips with some of the methodologies and so on. But I think we've got enough here that will get people on the road, and we certainly will be following up with activity on it. So thank you so much, Cormac. Wonderful session.
It's been my pleasure and privilege. Thank you so much. Thank you all as well, and go well. Stay safe.
And Valentina, is there anything else to close, or are we good?
No, I just want to thank everybody for participating, and see you next.
And thank you,
thank you
all in the Spanish Association for organizing the meeting. Much appreciated. And thank you, the interpreters, as ever, always.
Right.
Muchas gracias.
Have a nice day.
Hasta
All of
luego.
you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.